The Malefic Monsters were originally released in 2011 as part of the Bonds Beyond Time movie pack promotion, and many of them, most of them I should say, are not very good. Of the ones that saw play, one of the better ones was Malefic Stardust Dragon and Malefic Cyber End Dragon. Now all the Malefic cards have the exact same summoning condition, and they say this card cannot be normal summon or set, this card cannot be special summon except by removing from play one and then whatever the name of the normal card is from your extra deck or main deck, depending on where the card comes from. And then also, there can only be one Malefic face-up monster on the field, and other monsters you control cannot declare an attack, and if there is no face-up field spell card on the field, destroy this card. So that is a lot of restrictions, a lot of summoning things to put on one card, and for the most part, the Malefic Monsters didn't see a ton of competitive play. Both Cyber End Dragon and Stardust Dragon both saw play in a variety of stun decks. Cyber End Dragon happens to just be a really big monster, and many of the stun decks it was played in were also playing skill drain, so you could sort of just put a 4,000 attack monster on the board, maybe backed up by a Necro Valley or something along those lines, and your opponent was in a really tough position. Malefic Stardust Dragon actually takes it a step further. No, it doesn't have 4,000 attack, but it prevents your field spell from being destroyed, and that's really, really good when you're trying to protect things like Necro Valley. However, the other Malefic cards did not see a lot of play. They have a interesting field spell, and they have an interesting trap card, but for the most part, the main deck monsters that you were using with Malefics weren't really played outside of Cyber End Dragon and Stardust Dragon. The biggest problem with the cards like Malefic Blue Eyes White Dragon is that you are banishing cards from the main deck to summon them, which means that you're adding a whole bunch of bricks to your deck. In the case of Cyber End Dragon and Stardust Dragon, what made them so appealing is that you're banishing cards from your extra deck, so you don't actually have to play Garnets, you just have to use up extra deck spots, which is really easy for the stun decks because they weren't summoning a lot of extra deck monsters anyway. To those of you that did know what the Malefic Monsters did, that was probably not really helpful, but I would imagine many of you guys that are watching this video have never even heard of or seen any of the Malefic Monsters, not even the good ones like Stardust or Cyber End Dragon. I felt like you need to know the basics of the Malefic archetype before we look at these cards, because some of these cards might seem a little bit more powerful than they actually are when you take into account all the restrictions on the Malefic Monsters and building a Malefic deck. The biggest problem with building a Malefic only deck is that you just don't have enough main deck monsters. You pretty much only want to play Stardust and Cyber End Dragon because all the other ones are so bricky when you have to play these high level normal monsters to banish from your deck. Anyway, the first piece of support revealed, which was about a week ago, is called Malefic Divide, although that's sort of like a fanlation, so we're not entirely sure, and it is a quick play monster born. It says target one Malefic monster in your graveyard, special summon that monster, ignoring the summoning conditions, but its effects are negated and is banished during the end phase. Obviously, the big target for this card is Malefic Cyber End Dragon because it has 4,000 attack, and this card alone would not be good enough to really warrant making a video about Malefics. It is cool that they now have a monster born. Obviously, this is very centered not on a controlling strategy, but just on an OTK finisher because the card is banished during the end phase, but a monster reborn is simply not good enough to sort of build up an older deck that wasn't very good even in 2011 outside of a few fringe strategies. However, what makes this deck interesting is that they got two more pieces of support in the last couple days here, and those ones actually are pretty competitive, at least on paper, compared to the other Malefic cards. Will they be enough to actually build up this strategy to be a viable rogue deck? I'm not so sure about that, but at the very least they are cool and nice to look at just in the context of this legacy support, because Konami doesn't give legacy support nearly as often as I wish they did, so anytime that they do give legacy support, especially to a lesser known archetype, it's cool to look at how they're doing it and how they're trying to support that older theme. The second card revealed is called Malefic Selector, and I believe this was from the anime or from that movie at the very least, and here's what the anime version of the effect says. It says banish 2 Malefic monsters from your graveyard, add 2 Malefic cards from your deck to your hand. Now if this card, the real life version that's being printed, had that effect, it would be pretty good. Obviously the difficulty here is actually getting the Malefic monsters in your graveyard at all. You can use them for like link summons and stuff like that, but the requirement of having 2 Malefic monsters in your graveyard seems like a pretty steep cost, but you're getting a +1, you're getting free searches, it seems really good, and you can even loop itself because it doesn't require you to add something besides Malefic Selector. However, when they printed the real life version, there is a couple caveats added. The biggest difference is that this new version, the real life version of this card, requires you to add cards to your hand that are differently named than the cards that you banished. Now luckily you can banish 2 of the same named card if you happen to have like 2 copies of Malefic Cyber End Dragon in your graveyard, card. However, the fact that you have to add differently named cards from what you banish definitely hurts this card's overall consistency, because it means if you just play a couple one of Malefics that you don't necessarily want to draw and you only want to search, if you draw too many of those, now you can't activate this card at all. In general, when you're thinking of a card like this, you don't want to have to play all these bricky Malefic cards. There certainly are other cards that you can play, like the one we just talked about and the one that we're going to talk about. When we're looking at Malefic Selector in the context of just the older Malefic cards, it doesn't look that good with this new effect, because it can't search itself and it can't search the same name cards, so you have to branch out from Stardust and Cyber Enddragon, and you have to play other cards in your Malefic deck that actually have Malefic in their name, and that might not be as easy as it seems, especially because unlike a lot of searchers that are actually good, Malefic Selector is a searcher that's not a starter card. It can't be the first card you play. You already have to have some graveyard setup, and that might prove difficult for the Malefic strategy. I do want to go over the original field spell that this deck had back in 2011, because its effect is relevant for this new card. So Malefic World is not a very good field spell. I will just say that up front. It says, while this card is face up on the field, you can activate this effect instead of conducting a normal draw during your draw phase. Choose 3 Malefic cards from your deck and have your opponent pick one of them at random and add it to your hand. Shuffle the rest back into your deck. This card is not good at all. It is cool, I guess, that you can add Malefic cards to your hand, but it's a randomly adding effect, so it doesn't really work unless you just reveal 3 of the same thing, and in a lot of cases this card isn't going to make a huge impact. It has no protection for your Malefic monsters, it doesn't have an immediately activating effect, and in most cases where Malefics have seen play in the past, they just play Necro Valley instead. However, because of a new card that is now coming out, you probably will want to play Malefic World because the other card is so powerful. Malefic Territory is a continuous spell card with 3 very unique effects. The first effect says, when this card is activated, you can activate 1 Malefic World from your deck. While the card activated by this effect is in the field zone, neither player can target cards in field zones with effects. So it protects a field spell from being targeted by things like Twin Twisters or MST. That part doesn't matter as much. I'm not even sure how many copies of Malefic World that you'd play if you were actually playing this card, but the second and third effect are the way more important ones. So first off, there can be only one face-up Malefic monster on the field. Effects of Malefic monsters become there cannot be face-up Malefic monsters with the same name on the field. What this means is that finally you can put Stardust Dragon and Cyber End Dragon on the field at the exact same time. That is a lot of damage to do to an opponent, especially if you can find a way to revive a card with like the Monster Reborn that we talked about earlier. That'll pretty much be game every single time. There are a lot of cool things that you can do now that those cards can be controlled at the same time, as long as they have different names. That is a big deal for this deck. I think that's probably the most important effect of this card. And then lastly, during the battle phase only, the effects of Malefic monsters are negated. Why does that matter? Well, because the other restriction on the Malefic monsters is that you can only attack with them, or that other monsters can't attack. So when you restrict them from doing that, not only can you not put multiples on the board, you also can't attack if you manage to put multiples on the board in the first place. However, with this card, this Malefic Territory, you now can do everything that the Malefic monsters should be able to from the beginning. Maybe these cards would have been too strong in 2011 if they had these effects where they could actually just put multiple copies on the board and they could all attack just fine. I don't think that's actually true, and this does open you up to a few pieces of removal. The main thing that you have to deal with is that if Malefic Stardust Dragon is on the board, you're now negating its effect in the battle phase, so your opponent could destroy your field spell. That definitely hurts, and I think that it is something to consider, but I think overall this card is so good for the Malefic strategy. I don't know how important Malefic World will be. I mean, obviously I think you still want to play better field spells, but if you don't have a field spell when you activate this card, it seems like a pretty free activation to just put the Malefic World in your field spell zone so you can summon Malefic monsters in the first place. But I really like this card. I think it's this great card design for a lesser known legacy archetype. I think Konami is really showing that they are willing to look at these older archetypes and make them a little bit better, a little bit less casual, and into sort of rogue territory. I'm not sure if it's actually enough though. These 3 cards are good, but the problem with the old Malefic cards is that they're pretty much not playable, right? You have Stardust Dragon, you have Cyber End Dragon, now you're going to play Malefic World, but outside of that, I mean, Malefic Claw Stream is kind of cool, I guess. You might want to play like 1 or 2 copies. It is basically just a Regeki break that doesn't require a discord. That's kind of neat. I don't know if it's that good though, and I'm not sure if it's what this deck really wants, but I guess it could open up an OTK. But other than that, I mean, they have like the Tuner monster. That's not very good though. I'm not sure why you'd play the Tuner monster, and they have like Malefic Truth Dragon, but once again, the problem with these cards is that it kind of reminds me of the Cyberdark situation where the Konami gives Cyberdarks all these really cool new cards. You have Claw, Cannon, you have the Field Spell. The issue with Cyberdarks being that whenever you drew a hand of the older Cyberdarks, your hand was awful. You only wanted to see the new cards, and I'm kind of seeing that same situation happen with Malefics. You don't really want to draw a lot of the Malefic cards. I mean, Stardust and Cyber Dragon are pretty good. Maybe not like the best cards out there, but it seems like you really just want to draw territory. You really just want to draw the Monster Reborn card, not so much these other cards that you'd be searching with the Searcher. And even then, the Searcher isn't really a good Searcher because it's not a starter card. You already have to have a board set up. You already have to have like a board broken. How do you really set up a Malefic deck? I'm not entirely sure, but it's still cool. I mean, it's always cool when Konami supports older archetypes. I am a huge fan of legacy support in Yu-Gi-Oh! I think it's one of the best things about this game, because we don't have set rotation cards from 2011 like the Malefics can get support in 2019 or 2020, and people can still play those decks. They can still play with all those old cards. You don't have to play in like an expanded format or a wild format. You can just play those cards in the normal format, even though they're like 10 years old at this point. Anyway though, I will see you guys later. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on these new Malefic cards. Maybe we'll see some more revealed. I'm not entirely sure. It seems like the Malefic territory is so powerful that they would just kind of stop with that. I'm not entirely sure though. Maybe they'll release more. We'll have to wait and see. But I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.